Hello and a good morning and good afternoon from New York, from Europe. My name is Bart van Ark at the Conference Board, and welcome to our monthly Window On, which is our monthly virtual panel by the Conference Board on hot topics in the economy, policy and all related. This is the start of our fall program for September, October and November. A couple of really good topics to come up again. And today, again, a fantastic panel to discuss some key issues. A big issue today, Window on 2030, economy, business and society in the post-COVID era. First of all, you've seen a couple of practical guidelines in the intro video. The other thing I would add is that some of you will be eligible for CPE credits. If that's the case, then make sure that you click the link in the CEU request spot in the bottom right of the corner. During the webcast, there you can sign up for the credits, stay online for the entire webcast, click OK for free pop-ups that occur during the webcast, and credits will be available for participation, of course, in the webcast only. As an introduction, in the spring program of Window On, we spent most of our time, obviously, talking about the COVID-19 program, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way that this was impacting many aspects of the economy. We spent time on talking about the process of reopening, the future of innovation. We talked about fiscal policy. And today we want to pick up this topic one more time, perhaps not the last time, but for surely one more time, and focus our attention kind of the post-COVID-19 world. And how may the world look like by, say, 2030? And this, of course, is a little strange because we're still struggling with the aftermath of the first wave of the pandemic. We're still having major concerns about a possible second wave. We're already seeing some of that in European countries, and there are threats in the US. But at the same time, businesses also need to understand the longer-term risks and the opportunities that are ahead of them. So among the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, how will the fallout from the pandemic change the world, not just temporarily, but perhaps more permanently? And which behavioral changes have accelerated and which will continue to endure? And perhaps which might just revert to what they were before the pandemic. And how will long-term trends that already started before the pandemic, such as aging populations and digital transformation and climate change, how will they interact with these short-term impacts from the pandemic? We put 2030 in the title of this webcast. That may still feel a long way out, but it isn't. Even though times to develop new products and services have shortened, the ability to understand the underlying trends, and some of those may have simply been accelerated by the crisis. So 2030 may actually be with us much faster than it really will be in reality, perhaps even as soon as in a few years' time. So crises like these do set off paths to faster change and generate also more disruption. So a lot of things to discuss, and for that again we are blessed today by an excellent panel that I'm going to introduce to you. First of all, I'm going to introduce to you Mauro Grillen. Mauro is the holder of the Sandman Endowed Professorship in International Management at the Wharton School. He served as the director of the Loder Institute of Management and International Studies between 2007 and 2019. He received a PhD in sociology from Yale University and currently works on issues like internationalization of the firm, impact of globalization on patterns of organization, and on the diffusion of innovation in crisis. And very importantly, Mauro is the author of a brand new book which has the same title, and I will admit I borrowed the title a little bit from him for today's webcast, because the title is 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, a book that's just been published in August. And I also want to mention that Mauro and I later today will be recording a podcast on his book, which I would also recommend for the audience. Mauro, very welcome to this webcast, and great to have you on.
Bart, thank you so much for inviting me.
Pleasure. Second, we are going to zoom in a bit more. So Mauro is going to speak a little bit about the long-term societal trends, demographics, technology, environmental challenges. But second, we're going to zoom in a little bit more on the economy. Where do we work? How do we consume? What do we produce? And how will these trends impact the economic growth outlook? And for that section, I'm going to be joined by Dana Peterson. Dana is the new chief economist at the Conference Board. She's been taking over my role in that role, so it's going to be a very exciting role, and it's a great pleasure, Dana, to have you on today to work with us Dana joins the conference board from Citi, where she for many years served as the company's North America economist and served as the global economist for a long time, and she brings a wealth of experience extending to the public sector, also having worked at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Dana, welcome to this window on.
Thank you, Bart. Pleasure to be here.
And I should great to have you on, and I should perhaps add that as of next month, Dana, you're going to be the anchor for this window on. So, you can still look a little bit at a distance from a participant, but next time it's all on to you. And then finally, we're going to talk in this webcast about, okay, once we know what's happening in society and we understand some of these longer term trends, we understand what the impacts are going to be on the economy, how then are companies going to deal with those uncertainties, and how do they best prepare for some of these very large changes that are going to happen in their business environment in the longer term? And for that, I'm going to be joined today by Martin Reeves. Martin is leading the Boston Consulting Group Henderson Institute worldwide. That's BCG's think tank on new approaches on strategy and management. He's also a member of BCG Henderson's Institute's Innovation Sounding Board, and a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review and other Fortune and other very important journals. Martin, it's great to have you on. It's not the first time we do some of this. Good to have you here.
Good to have you here. Looking forward to it.
Real pleasure. Real pleasure. Okay. So let's move on right away and dive a little bit into the first topic on sort of the longer term trends. And we have a couple of poll questions for you as always on Window On, and my colleagues in the digital team are going to bring that poll on right now. Our poll questions, at least the first one, are a little bit complex today, so we're going to, and a little tricky, so we're going to take a little bit of time for this. And particularly on this one, where the question is looking back 10 years in 2030, when you look back a decade, what is then you think the most important trend that will have changed the world? So in 2030, and you would look back 10 years, what do you think will have been the most important event that will have changed the world? What is tricky about this question is that you might perhaps pick everything, because perhaps everything is important. We want to see what is top of mind. What do you think is really important? What will really be the most important factor that is going to change events in the coming 10 years? Not sort of denying that the other factors are important as well. So take your time, think about what is most top of mind here, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to very briefly respond and give a first impression of what they are seeing here in terms of results. So we'll give you a little bit more time to think through what your most important picks are. And let's give it about sort of 5 more seconds. I know there are a lot more people on the call than people are responding, so take your time. We go to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the poll is closed. Very good. So we see an interesting distribution of results. The top votes, actually 2 times 24% of the votes, are going to the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. Those are the two that are being picked as the most important. 18% go to digitization of society, 11% to rising inequality and more civil unrest, or perhaps even war, and about 9% are going to go to the loss of American global political and economic leadership. So let's quickly check the temperature with our panelists, starting with Mauro and then Dana and then Martin. Mauro, your first impression when you look at this, you've been writing on all these things. Are you surprised about this outcome? What would be your top of mind?
I am not surprised in the following sense, which is that obviously the pandemic is now dominating all of our thinking. But obviously several of the other options that were listed on the screen are highly correlated with the pandemic in a way that I will explain a little bit later, which is that those are, for the most part, trends that the pandemic will probably accelerate, with the only exception of climate change. So I am not surprised, but actually encouraged to see that tied with the COVID pandemic, we see climate change as a very important concern in the minds of those attending here today. And I think, every crisis presents an opportunity to rethink what is it that we're doing. And of course, my hope is that when it comes to climate change, this will be a moment in which we will rethink some of the things that we're doing. So more to come later on each of these.
Thanks. Very good. Dana, you're next. What is your first impression of these results?
Bart, I also am not surprised by the pairing of the pandemic as well as climate change. And indeed, when we think about the recovery from the pandemic, a number of governments are thinking about implementing climate change or green energy and green infrastructure in the plans in order to recover from the pandemic. So I think that these two very much are tied together.
And finally, Martin, your first.
Yeah, I actually couldn't find the two buttons I was looking for. I was looking for all of the above or none of the above, because all of the above in the sense that the intersection of trends, the complexity of those dynamics is the opportunity for business. And then none of the above in the sense that sector and macro trend we know determine almost none of competitive advantage. So from a, I guess the key word was the most important trend. From a strategist perspective, in a sense, all of the above and none of the above. But I'm not surprised by the spread. I mean, that complexity will continue to persist, I think.
Yeah, great answer. And indeed, I deliberately had not added all of the above because I'm sure that many of us would have picked that one as well. So, okay, very good. So let's close the poll and let's go a little bit more into detail, Mauro, about sort of the bigger societal trends. So in your book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. In that book, you hit on many key trends that shape the world by 2030. Indeed, there is not a single one. You put a lot of emphasis on demographics, on behavioral differences between generations, digital transformation, the sharing economy, cities, inequality. And probably there's a COVID-19 angle to all of those. At least I could think about that. So how do you now see this interaction of this? You wrote this book before the pandemic happened. You have a postscript at the end of the book just to, work in the pandemic. But what has changed in your thinking once COVID happened on the body of the main trends that you were describing?
Yes, Bart, thank you for inviting me to comment on that point. And first of all, I want to recognize something really important that Martin said, which is that, of course, trends don't create winners and losers necessarily. It all depends on what we make of them. And it all depends on to what extent we see them as threats or we can turn them into opportunities. But this is what I see, Bart. What I see is a big acceleration of pre-existing trends. And let me show you some examples. The first is the decline in fertility. This was, as you know, a trend that was going on before the pandemic that is changing every single market in the world. And of course, the pandemic, because of the economic implications and the uncertainty that it generates, will only exacerbate that trend. So in other words, people are going to postpone having babies. And the mere postponement of having babies is going to further reduce fertility, which means, of course, that population aging will advance unless, of course, we see a very sharp increase in mortality at very, very high ages, which I'm not. So in other words, this is going to produce more population aging, so we can get later into the implications of this for pension systems, into the implications of this also for consumer markets. So by the year 2030, the largest consumer segment will be the population above age 60 in Europe, in China, in the United States by spending power. That is my prediction. And that's going to change quite a few things. Now, another thing that I think the pandemic accelerates, and it's a trend that I discuss in my book at length, is the rise of emerging markets. Not every emerging market is handling the pandemic well, but some of the most important of those emerging markets are, most notably China. So the figures for forecast for GDP from the conference board, so Dana, I'm sure, can also speak to that, are very clear, which is that the decline in GDP activity during 2020 will be less in China and other emerging markets than in Europe and the United States. And the recovery is already swifter, and the figures, the forecasts for 2021 indicate that GDP growth is going to advance. So if prior to the pandemic, we were thinking that emerging markets might grow on average 4 percentage points faster, right, than mature economies, I think as a result of the pandemic, we're going to see at least that number of points go up by 1 or 2, okay, in terms of the growth differential. And then let me just mention two other things that I think are really important. E-commerce. Of course, this was a trend that was going on before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated that trend. And it has created e-commerce markets that I never thought would emerge. For example, e-commerce at very short distances, less than 25 miles. This was something that was not big or that big or that important before the pandemic, but now it is. And you know what? Amazon is not the company that has taken advantage of that. It's been Shopify, the Canadian platform. And what we're going to see, I think, in the future is that many of those businesses that didn't have an online presence before the pandemic are going to continue having it after the pandemic. They're going to move into a hybrid model. And then lastly, the sharing economy. I make a big deal out of it in the book. Obviously, it has been tough for companies such as Uber or Lyft or Airbnb to deal with the new realities. But look, linking this to climate change, we continue to waste as consumers a third of the food that is produced here in the United States, in Europe, in other rich countries. We continue to waste a lot of clothes. And you know what? The clothing sector and the agricultural sector combined account for nearly 30% of our carbon emissions, if you include the transportation costs. So I think the sharing economy, which hasn't really made great inroads into the agricultural sector in terms of food consumption and into clothing, I think has a future now that is brighter. So in closing, 10 seconds, my only regret, Bart, is that instead of titling the book 2030, I should have chosen 2028 as the title, because the future is arriving much faster as a result of this pandemic. That is, I think...
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was referring to so earlier. This may come earlier to us now. It may be 2:30 before we realize it, so that's a great point. Dana, it's a lot to talk about. We will talk about the economy in the second section, but I'd like you to comment a little bit, if you can, on the global demographics point that Mauro is driving and the decline in fertility. What kind of implications will that have for the global economy?
There are massive implications, Bart. When we look at who actually spends and who has the money, it's actually older people in advanced economies. And if we have fewer of those folks who are going to be spending, certainly as your life cycle process proceeds, you spend less when you're older. And also given the fact that we've had a pandemic, which will lessen the amount of travel and kind of discretionary spending that's happening, then that means that we potentially have slower growth unless we can really galvanize the younger generations, especially emerging markets, making sure that they're educated for the types of jobs that are needed and making sure that they're able to consume. So certainly aging populations, not only in advanced economies but China as well, have very material implications for global consumption as well as regional consumption. And certainly the way that people consume and what they're consuming is going to be very important. Especially with the younger generations, they're more apt to consume online and have these kind of virtual types of consumption, also experiential types of consumption. And so businesses need to make sure that they're aligning themselves to not only manage the decline in the kind of the wealthy older spenders, but the younger, more finicky, persnickety types of spenders who want experiences.
I mean, thinking a little bit more about this aging point, and of course it's clear that aging in the Western world, in China, is very important. There are also major portions of the developing world where population growth is still very rapid. And some of that are in countries that are doing okay, but a lot of it is in countries that at least at the moment are not doing okay. So how do you view that? I mean, there's on the one hand, there is this sort of aging in one part of the world, there is this rapid population growth in other parts of the world, there are potential migration effects. Mauro, I'm sure you have something to say that as well, but let me start with you, Dana, on what your response on that will be.
Yes, absolutely. When we look at the regions that have very young populations and lots of population growth, that includes the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of EM Asia and Latin America. And the key thing is that with many of these economies, you have an oversupply of labor, but that labor may not necessarily be skilled. And there's also an undersupply of jobs, right? And so you have this matching issue. And so I think that certainly migration is going to continue to be something that's very material. Now, developed economies are kind of closing their doors to migration, so that presents a problem. So there needs to be investment, not only a private investment, but also government investment in these regions that have these very young populations, again, to make sure that they're educated and that there are the types of jobs that they can actually take on to pick up the reins, if you will, of growth.
Yeah, Mauro, just because I know that you've been writing about this in your book, just to wrap this point up on migration, you I think are playing it down a little bit. You say sort of in the scale of things, migration is just not as big a deal as many people make it to be.
Well, it is a big deal from the point of view, I think, of the benefits that it can bring, but also if it's not managed correctly, the tensions that it can create, especially in the host society. But you're right. I mean, as a percentage of the total population in the world, international migration from one country to another pales by comparison with migration from rural areas to cities throughout sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in many other parts of the world. That doesn't mean, of course, that those migration flows are always welcome. And, of course, we're seeing a turn towards anti-immigration sentiment in many places. At the same time, we're also seeing certain countries, and I always mention Canada, which is taking advantage of migration in a way that I think is conducive to economic growth. So, look, the issue is that we have population aging in this country. We have anywhere between 25 and 35% of healthcare occupations, doctors, nurses. Those are foreign-born people. We don't produce enough of certain kinds of workers here in the United States. So we need some kind of rational immigration policy.
With the emphasis on the rational, and that's going to be the tough one. Martin, let us bring you in and remind the other speakers of muting themselves. Martin, I want to bring you in on the other point that Mauro was making, which is the role of e-commerce, the role of the sharing economy in the technological part. To what extent do you see indeed COVID, accelerating these kind of trends in the economy, as Mauro is saying? Martin, can you hear us? Right now we cannot hear you, Martin. This is an interesting challenge. Right now we can...
Maybe come back to me. The software is giving some problems here.
You can hear you now. People in the digital team can... We could hear Martin, but I apologize for the fact that Martin had some audio problems even before we got on. So I think at the moment it's probably best to continue. Let me go back to you, Dana, for a second, and just ask you if you have any comments sort of on the technology side of the points that Mauro was making, the role of sharing economy, the role of e-commerce. Do you think that indeed, the COVID-19 crisis is accelerating this?
Oh, yes, indeed. I definitely believe that COVID certainly did accelerate these already persistent trends that we were seeing in terms of people using technology. In terms of what it means for the economy, on the one hand, it's great. It's great for total factor productivity, or TFP, where you have the absorption of these existing technologies, and that's supportive of GDP growth. However, you also have the issue of automation and the implications that automation is going to have for labor markets. Indeed, when we look at the U.S. in particular, something like 95% of jobs are vulnerable to some form of automation. And automation doesn't necessarily mean, oh, the robots are coming. It just means that it could also mean that there's a certain type of technology that will make what you're doing, less valuable. And so we're going to have to think about finding the right balance between implementing technology and making sure that there's a proper adoption, and that we don't have huge swaths of the population that are now becoming unemployed because we're including this technology. And that's really a policy question for governments as well as for businesses, and making sure that we do train the next generation not only to be able to manage this new technology, but that we're also not forgetting about older workers who are still very much integral to economies, to make sure that they're also capable of managing.
Yeah, and Mauro, just to go back to you for a second, I know that you're also talking a lot about technology and the relationship between technology and aging as being a very important one, and it's both trends are being accelerated by COVID, there's kind of an additional effect from these two factors coming together, right?
No, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with Dana that automation and the challenges that it presents to jobs is going to be a key subject matter for the next few years. But when you think about consumer markets and when you think about new applications of technology, I think that consumer group that I was referring to earlier, the population above age 60, in the future is going to be a much heavier user of technology. We're seeing many applications in terms of technology that helps people above that age have a better lifestyle, right? Better quality of life. We're also going to see, I think, a lot of healthcare applications of technology, from virtual reality all the way to automation of healthcare delivery. We're in the midst of a revolution right now in terms of telemedicine, as you know, right? Which is something that other parts of the world have pioneered, but that was not that prevalent here in the United States. And one last point, Bart, which I think is also extremely important, which is that for those participants who are in financial services, we have a big problem above maybe the age of 70 or 75, which is financial abuse of the elderly. And I think technology can go a long way in terms of addressing that problem. As you know, it is a problem that should be measured in billions of dollars per year, and it can be devastating to some of those individuals who fall prey to those schemes. So I think, we need a lot of creativity, a lot of entrepreneurship, and I think technology and technology-based solutions can make life, now that we're living longer and longer and longer, much better for us in the future.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting connection indeed between aging and technology, and how technology also can help indeed for the aging population to protect them better and give them more security and safety. Let's continue on the economic effects, and we'll hope we'll be able to bring Martin back in a little later during this webcast. And again, we're going to start this section with a poll question. Obviously, a lot of the economic trends are not independent from what we've been talking about so far, but I'd like to zoom in a little bit, and the team is bringing up this question. Again, this is a bit of a tricky question, and particularly what I want to warn you for is that we are asking here this question about how you expect living standards. And living standards is not GDP per capita. Living standards is broader than that. How you expect that to improve or not to improve over the next 10 years, and what it will do to the inequality. What will it do into the gap between the richest and the poorest section of the population? So you have multiple answers there. The first two answers give you the opportunity to say, well, it will improve, but the inequality will increase, decrease, or stay about the same. And the last three answers will tell you, the living standards will decline over the next 10 years, but the inequality will increase, will decrease, or will remain about the same. So it's a little bit of a tricky question, so we're going to give you a little bit of time to think this through on where you find yourself. First of all, there are two sides to this. Will the overall cake improve? And secondly, will the distribution of that cake improve? And we're talking about global citizens here. So think about income distribution within your country, but also the income distribution across countries, which is equally important here. So let you absorb this a little bit to look at those various answers, and then we'll give it a couple more seconds and let each of the panelists respond. So 5 more seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then we'll stop. So the majority of you, 37%, are saying it will improve, but inequality will increase. So the gap between the rich 25% of the global population and the poorest 25% of the population will increase. At the same time, there is also 27%, it's less, but still 27% of you who are arguing it will decline and the gap will increase. So that's a really negative scenario. Living standards will weaken and the gap will increase. So what is left is going to the richer part. 20% of you are saying it will improve and the living and the inequality will narrow. So there, luckily also about 20% of you are optimists and think this will all come out. So again, it's interesting to see. This is really a pretty big diversity in response. Damien, let me start with you. Surprised that you see this kind of wide distribution?
Well, I'm a little bit encouraged that most people think that living standards will continue to improve, but certainly it is quite depressing that people also believe that these gaps will increase. And I would suggest that certainly during the pandemic, a lot of the gaps, between men and women, wealthy versus non-wealthy, minority groups around the world, even the way different governments reacted, that this is all pointing to further differentiation and certainly increases in gaps between those who have and those who have
Mauro,
not.
first response here, surprised?
Well, I am encouraged. I am encouraged. I'm an optimist, as you know, so I'm encouraged to see that the first two options received 57% if you combine them, meaning that improve. And if you add the third option, then you get nearly 2/3 of our participants saying that they believe there might be an improvement, right? So that's good. I would say I think we need to think carefully about different parts of the world. So let's take China first. China is coming out of this crisis very strongly. And yes, inequality has increased in China, but as they bring in more people under the poverty line into the middle class, those big inequalities of the recent past in China, I think, will start to slow down and perhaps even be reversed, okay? And this may also happen in other emerging markets depending on how quickly the economy recovers and how many people who right now are below the poverty line end up being lifted above it into the middle class. That's, I think, one dynamic. And again, there will be some emerging markets in which I think the pessimists, so the 27% who voted that there will be a decline and also there's going to be a widening of inequality.
Briefly.
But then we have Europe and the United States, right? And yes, the U.S. economy may recover a little bit more quickly, but my quick point here is that I still don't see anything showing for the United States that as the economy recovers that we're going to see less inequality. For the reasons that Dana was mentioning, we see that the impact of the pandemic, even after we put it behind us, hopefully, will continue to hurt the poor, will continue to hurt minority groups more so than others, and that is not the way in which we want to, evolve as a society. And by the way, this will have implications for consumption in the United States. I mean, to the extent that you have more and more inequality, that's going to reduce the growth in consumption. And this is a consumer-oriented
And that's a good
economy.
transition to Dana, because Dana, I wanted to ask you exactly that. When we think a little bit about what these trends are, we probably need to sort of carve this out a little bit into what are the impacts on labor, what are the impacts on how we produce, how the impacts on how we consume things. So can you take us a little bit through on how some of these different aspects are playing out over the next 10 years in the economy?
Sure, and I think one thing we've learned from the pandemic is a key word is differentiation. First looking at how governments responded to the pandemic. Some governments were very restrictive in their activities, others were less so, and even the way people and businesses responded, where some people were very concerned and really, restricted their own activities, and other folks were, a little less concerned about the virus, etc. But nonetheless, we had this economic fallout. And as Mauro already mentioned, even regionally, we had major differences. So, for example, China, for example, had a very strong reaction. And so they're bouncing back more quickly. Whereas, the U.S., Brazil, certain other economies, parts of Europe had, somewhat more delayed reactions, and hence you had more cases. And then the economic restrictions were more intense. And so with all these things, we've seen these differences happening in these dichotomies. So one big thing that I'd like to focus on is the effect on women, right? So we've more or less erased many of the gains in labor force participation for women in the last 6 months, right? And going forward, there are going to be these very big decisions for families in terms of how women are interacting in the labor market, how women are caring for children, how we educate our children, and making those decisions whether or not women are going to be able to re-enter the labor market, just given the familial dynamics around the world. So that's one issue. Certainly in terms of looking at how different industries are responding. Certainly, I like to divide industries into two categories: your work, quote-unquote, work industries, and your quote-unquote, play industries. So your work industries are those sectors that are, very much equated with work, like the financial sector, manufacturing, and these are sectors that are much more amenable to social distancing and are very much tied to mandatory things that we all must do. And even I would even toss in the technology sector. And we know the technology sector has really outperformed. It probably will continue to do so. And we've seen that the manufacturing sector is more or less bounced back. The financial sector is on its way. And so anyone who's involved in those sectors, which also, manufacturing, you can't necessarily work from home, but you can socially distance. Financial sector, you can work from home. And so many of those types of sectors have done well and probably will continue to advance. But then you have your quote-unquote play sectors, right, that are more discretionary in nature, things like travel, tourism, highly personal services, many aspects of the gig economy, certain types of retail that suffer tremendously and will probably be materially, potentially permanently affected by this. Mauro talked about many of this, looking at the retail sector in terms of how people are buying things and consuming things. That's going to change fundamentally. And so it's going to accelerate what we've already seen in terms of, the quote-unquote retail apocalypse, where you had, brick and mortar stores competing with online stores and big box stores. And you're just going to see that really continue. People are going to change their behaviors around travel, especially business travel, may never be the same, as many businesses are realizing, yes, we can carry on businesses remotely. Yes, our clients are willing to do video calls. We're all doing this, and some of these things will continue to persist. And so we're going to see very massive changes in the way businesses operate going forward, and that's going to have material implications for growth, for GDP.
Great. Martin, we have you back, and I hope we can hear you now. We're going to but I'd like you to comment a little bit on all the issues of technology that have been raised by both Mauro and Martin, both in terms of e-commerce and things like that in the previous section, but also here when we talk about the future workforce and the role of technology. So what's your view on how technology is playing into this?
Well, I think it's again, I speak from the perspective of a business strategist. I think in some ways it's less important than we think. I mean, we had a business before the personal computer and business after the personal computer, and the relative attractiveness of different industries and different companies didn't change a bit. We just increased the cost of doing business. We received an operational benefit, but an operational benefit is not necessarily a competitive benefit. And then, of course, if you look at the history of technology, you don't get aggregate productivity increases until you have accompanying social reforms. In other words, electricity doesn't change productivity until you change the factory layout, which is sort of a social innovation. So I think a couple of things are going to happen. I think we are beginning to have a major change, which is the reinvention of organization, for the simple reason that if you make some stuff really fast, the technology, and other stuff, the humans, is going really slow, then what do we really mean by organization? So I talk about a hybrid learning organization, which is essentially a way of combining algorithms and people synergistically, and I call that organization. So what is that organization? Well, there are a handful of companies out there that are hot at work inventing that, but we don't have the textbook for that yet. So that's going to be one major change, the way that we organize work. Secondly, and it echoes back to an earlier question, I think the one big thing about COVID is it is fast and fast changing. And so therefore we very much get into not static strategy. Do I have a high relative market share? Do I have big assets? Am I efficient? These are static considerations, to dynamic strategy, which is, am I able to learn, adapt, and shape with advantage? Which will disappear, shortly thereafter and have to be reinvented. So I think everyone's favorite word right now is resilience. So it's not a new word, and we've been talking about it for a long time. Now we're talking about it a lot, but the interesting thing about resilience is we don't really have a playbook for resilience. So if I ask any CFO, how do you measure resilience? or in your big investment proposal for the new factory, how do you factor in the value of flexibility, the value of option value? We haven't operationalized it. So one of the things that I'm heavily investing in, I have my own time and the time of the researchers that work for me, and we're sort of putting our own sweat and dollars into operationalizing resilience. And technology can help a lot there, of course, because part of resilience is adapting very quickly to things, and another part of it is pattern recognition and rapid learning. But it's not entirely technological. The impact of technology, the last comment I'll make is that the technology has impacts on what the humans do. So I think we will need to migrate our own cognition to more unique human capabilities, ones connected to empathy and creativity, which will further impact what we mean exactly by organization in 2030.
Yeah, those are really good points on how technology is having both the sort of positive effects on how people accelerate their own resources, but also our potential threats for how people can advance, and some major implications for strategy that you're talking about. There are a few questions out there that sorry, Martin, you wanted to add something to that?
Maybe just one important quick point, which is don't only think about technology, because technology can be a confounder. In other words, an apparently reasonable thing that many companies may be thinking right now is, e-commerce is accelerating, need to accelerate my digitization. It's not untrue, but pursuing digitization as some sort of process, some sort of end in its own right, can be profoundly damaging. I think we have to think about the competitive strategy fundamentals. What job am I trying to get done, essentially? How am I trying to generate advantage? Because the technology is a way of facilitating the achievement of specific competitive ends, but it's also a huge distraction if you just pursue technology in its own right.
Yeah, that's a good, Mario, let's take up a little bit on that point, but also I'd like to pick up just a question that was just asked a minute ago. There are some more questions coming in right now, but there was one question, I have to move up a little bit, on the point of global differentiation. How do you see countries' competitiveness changing in terms of attracting investments, employees, tourists, as a result of government handling of the pandemic, short-term versus long-term? I'm going to ask you that first, and maybe Dana has also a response to this.
Well, clearly, I think not just the attraction of tourists, but more broadly the reputation, the national brand of countries right now, is under threat, or certain countries in the world, because of the way in which they're handling the pandemic. And unfortunately, some of the worst stereotypes about national brands, I think are resurfacing, because it is true that in Latin America, it is true that in Southern Europe, it is true that in India, that the pandemic has not been handled as well as in other parts of the world. So yes, this is going to be really an important thing for the future. But obviously, Bart, when it comes to tourism, or when it comes to bilateral flows, the pandemic creates this unusual situation in which it doesn't only matter what happens in a particular country. What matters is what happens in a pair of countries. And that's why, for example, in Europe this summer, they tried to establish these safe corridors. So let's say, Germans could travel to this country, right, but not to that other country. So you need the pandemic to be under control, both at the origin and at the destination, in order for the exchange to make sense and to take place. So I think it's a very important question, but I would, again, more broadly say that I think national reputations are at stake. And by the way, there's also this global race for the vaccine. Whoever gets an effective vaccine first is also going to get quite a bit of attention and probably quite a bit of leverage.
Dana, any final comments on this section?
Well, I think this is also tied into the next question that's in the chat, just thinking about global supply chains and what we're seeing, and also in terms of trade. And what we're seeing fundamentally is that the pandemic highlighted feelings that were already out there among governments towards becoming more inwardly focused. At some governments, certainly advanced economies, and then others, looking to be more broad and gain influence. And we have this kind of tug of war, and we're seeing that being played out in trade channels. We're seeing it played out with supply chains. And certainly with the pandemic, when we saw all of a sudden that supply chains were very much intricately linked across the global economy, and one economy kind of shuts down, that affects everyone. Everyone's kind of thinking about this. So I think, something we need to be thinking about over the next decade is how will we produce, where will we produce, and how will we move products around the world? And are there going to be these barriers that get thrown up in terms of governments using this as leverage for exuding power? So I think that that's a big theme that hasn't really come up, but I think it's very important for us to think about this, because again, as economists, when we see trade lessen, that means that you have less growth. And so certainly you want to see growth as an economist, because that feeds into everything else. Labor markets, investment, it's just kind of a self-fulfilling type of thing. But certainly if we have these types of interventions that are limiting in terms of how businesses are able to conduct themselves.
So let's move to, time is flying in this discussion. It was to be expected given the big topics we're talking about. But let's move to the final section on strategy. And we have again a poll question there, which my colleagues come in, and then Martin will discuss this in a little more detail. You're ready made to start on the strategy implications. So let's first ask you this question. This is a much simpler question. In my organization or a past organization that you have worked in, the balance between attention for short-term challenges and longer-term risk and opportunity is either excellent, because the leadership really communicates strategic direction and priorities in short and versus long term. It's good, as there is attention for both, but it's not always that clearly prioritized. It could be better, as day-to-day events tend to take over all the time. And finally, it's not good, because leadership does not have or does not communicate a strategic vision. So do you think it's really good because there's really good communication, a good balancing? It's okay, but not clearly prioritized. It could be better because day-to-day events take over, or it's not good because leadership does not clearly communicate a strategic vision. We'll give it sort of 5 more seconds. Then I'll ask Dana, Mauro, and for a quick comment, and then Martin will take us through in a bit more detail. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the poll is closed right now. So exactly half of you are saying it's good. There is attention for both, but it's not always clearly prioritized. And then it's a little less, but still 30% of you are saying it's excellent. It's really well communicated. And 20% of you are saying it could really be better because real-time events take over all the time. Dana, first response. Surprised? Is that what you've been seeing with companies you have worked with?
Well, I'm not surprised. I think that a number of companies, even before the pandemic, are always focused on what's right in front of us, but also creating strategic plans for what we're looking to do going forward. And I think during the pandemic, what we've learned that communication is key, and that if businesses have a great outlook, that if they're not communicating that down the chain of labor, then they're not going to see that executed, and it creates a lot of uncertainty and certainly hampers productivity. So I'm glad to see that most people think that there's good attention, but there's still.
Well, I think it's to be expected that there will be variation here, and as you can see, we got almost like a normal distribution centered on good, right? Look, my point always is we are all, when we're managers, subject to short-term pressures and demands. But there's no way of having good short-term performance without having, in addition, a long-term perspective on where things are going. And my only point here is that, I frequently attend or get invited to the annual strategy meeting, long-term strategy meeting at companies, and typically they adopt a 5-year time horizon. And quite frankly, I try to persuade them that they should adopt a 10-year time horizon as opposed to 5. So I think another very important debate here should be what is long-term Is it 3 years?
That's interesting. So, Martin, you coined recently the concept of all-weather company, the company that needs to, at this point in time, prepare for the recession, anticipate the rebound, and reimagine operations, products, and businesses for the longer term. So, where does the short and the long term really in when it comes to strategy?
Right. So a crisis, we're currently in the middle of some sort of crisis, and so we need perhaps a special type of strategy. The interesting thing about a crisis is if you look at negative deviations at the level of all sectors over time, crises only account for less than 10% of the total time elapsed across an economic cycle. So we don't really have time to learn from them. We tend to react and then forget, and so we tend to treat them as sort of like a timeout. It's a temporary deviation from the real game, which is the times when there is growth and plenty. And we tend to be guided by the intuitive model of a crisis, which goes along the following lines. Crisis is a temporary negative deviation of performance. The most important thing is the defense of performance. That's all about cost discipline. It's probably not the best time to take some wildly speculative new venture. And if you wait long enough, things will return to normal or something resembling normal. In fact, if you look at the numbers, it turns out really not to be a true picture of a crisis. So first of all, we can say that a crisis is not just a temporary deviation from normality, but actually it's critical for long-term performance. So about 30% on average of long-term performance is determined by performance during a crisis. And there are some very famous, high-performing companies, such as Berkshire Hathaway, whose outperformance is almost entirely due to their performance during crises. 2/3 of long-term performers outperform during crises, so it's not a temporary deviation. Secondly, economists talk in terms of averages and trends, and that's important, but of course competitive strategy is about deviation from trends. It's about uniqueness. And so about 14% of companies outperform during crises, not just in competitive terms, but in absolute terms. In other words, they grow more and they grow the bottom line more. Now, if you look at what is actually important in those situations, what determines that whether you're part of what we call the flourishers, the companies that are able to create advantage in adversity, there's a couple of things that are a little counterintuitive. So one of them is that using semantic analysis, we can show that those companies have a long-term orientation, a longer-term orientation during a crisis than the average company, which tends to contract its time horizons. Secondly, they're very externally oriented, so we maybe tend to be more focused defensively on operations during a crisis, but actually it's the time when these flourishing companies actually look outwards. And it makes sense, right, because you can't adapt unless you're looking at the thing that you're supposed to be adapting to. Capital allocation is critical. So a lot of companies during crises we see doing the right things qualitatively, directionally, but of course if you don't reallocate capital, then you're not going to be investing sufficiently in new growth drivers. And by the way, 2/3 of the difference between the companies that perform in crises and those that don't is from growth, not costs. And that's all about, and those sources of growth we can show are different from the ones that were predominant going into a crisis. So it's all about spotting new growth drivers and investing in them. So what does this mean in terms of like the mind of a strategist? I think it means, firstly, it means being psychologically countercyclical. It means be longer term when others are not thinking long term. It means think about growth when others are not thinking about growth. So just as Warren Buffett says, be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy, the strategic equivalent to that, I think, is think about growth when others are not thinking about growth. It means actually shifting the focus over time. So initially we may be focused on reaction, and then we may be focused on recession and resilience and recovery. But eventually we have to think about reimagination. We have to think about the creative part of strategy. And so that's the topic. If I give an unabashed plug to a new book I got coming out, I'm writing a book called The Imagination Machine, which comes out next year, which is about the creative side of strategy, and about the fact that nothing of permanent value in business or long-term value in business was created except through imagination. Entrepreneurs know that. big companies somehow forget their messy entrepreneurial origins. So one of the strange and pleasant things that's happened to me during the crisis is I do see a lot of CEOs being interested and worried about the imaginative capacity of their organizations, and probably the longest term thing they can do is to worry about that during a crisis. And I see a lot of that, and I also see a lot of that paying off in terms of some Chinese companies already outperforming their peers through acts of innovation and imagination to defy a trend. So this question you asked of your audience, are you managing the long term? Are you really focused on the long term? Of course, to some extent, everybody is. But the question is, do you do that sooner than your competitors? And to be there, I think you have to worry about imagination and the creative side of strategy, because you need to detect emerging new growth pillars and invest in them.
Right, great points. And we only have about 3 minutes left, so if you give a little bit of time, Mauro. Imagination, is this indeed the time for business leaders to be imaginative and to think about the future? And how do you get them there?
Yeah, also more creativity, I would say. Look, I think the single most important thing right now is to realize that we cannot go back to where we were before this pandemic. There's no going back. So there's only one way forward. And we need to assess very carefully what the impact of each of these trends is going to be. Now, you also asked me in the closing comments to name 2 or 3 things that are going to characterize the world in 2020 compared to 2020. And let me just say, rebalance by age, more emerging, right, and tech-driven.
Can you say it again? The question is, I was going to ask this to all of you, so I'm doing it now. Whether you can give us, whether you can characterize the world in 3 words, comparing it to 2020. What are your favorite 3 words? Can you say them again, Mauro?
Okay, so I'm not going to use older. Rather, I'm going to say rebalance by age. That's the first one. The second one is more emerging. And the third is
rebalance by age, more emerging, and tech-driven. Dana, what are your 3 favorite words in 2030, and you compare yourself then with 2020?
Sure. I think 3 words would be differentiated, policy-driven.
Wow. And Martin, you were 3 words for 2030.
Resilience, reimagination, and I'd love to find a 3rd one beginning with R, but I can't think of one on the spot. But it would be essentially hybrid organization, the idea of machines and people, algorithms and people.
Well, I think Dana, what was it? Well, Dana, I think your topics already laid out for a couple of window-ons in the next couple of months, and just looking at those words, but they're good words wrapping everything up. We have to end. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for joining, but most importantly, of course, thanks to Dana Peterson, Mauro Grillen, and Martin Rees for being with us, taking us through a big topic like this, and make some pointed comments here. Sorry for some of the technological hiccups, but we worked ourselves through this very well. This is my last window on. We started this series about 4 years ago, just at the time that President Trump was being elected, and we're all trying to work out what was going on, and that what is going on became the topic for this sort of a monthly series, which I've greatly enjoyed. I wish Dana, who is taking over this role, great success in programming and running this show. Next month, she will start with the global economic outlook and have some experts around the table to discuss how we're sort of more the short-term perspective looking at the longer term. Thank you for joining. Wish you all a great day. My name is Bart van Ark at the Conference Board.